I want to talk to you today about poetry, specifically mystic poetry, or the archetypal poetry. Now, there are two levels of poetry. The one that we know in our Western culture is what we could say, we could call it the personal unconscious conscious, the popular poetry, which says, you know, me and my buddies, or me and my cat. It speaks only about your own personal biographical things. But there is another layer of poetry, which is really a lost shamanic tradition in the Western culture, the archetypal poetry. It speaks on the level of the collective unconscious, if you like, the archetypes, the level of the soul, and it speaks in its own language. Now, how it happened, for instance, to me, how I got involved with this mystic poetry is well, it's a long story, but I'll go into it in my new book. But it initially started off with dreams, like all really archetypal information that is passed on through starts usually with dreams, and then it also came through in art for me. The first 3 or 4 paintings that I did in Melbourne, of which I use on the covers of my books. And then later this one and the other ones that I did while I was traveling through Scandinavia. But poetry itself, the deeper, the mythological poetry, happened in a way that I was already back in Australia from my travels, and I had like I do now, a sacred place. And that sacred place was in my old parents' home, and it was a swing around which there was a tent set up, or a roof. There on the ground I had flowers planted, and my dog used to lie on the ground there. I had a little table in front of me. There were my books, my little notepads, and I had a pencil. Usually I like writing with pencil back in the day. And at that time I had a book given to me prior to my journey to Scandinavia as a going away gift by friends, called Dictionary of Symbols by Tom Chetwynd. And so there I would be sitting in my sacred space, and I would open the book and just simply start reading at whatever place that I've opened, or I might be interested in an image that I saw in my dreams, for instance, a fountain. So that I would look at the fountain, and you know, the book is set up in such a way that one thing connects to another, and then you have to look up another image, another symbol that connects to another, and that activates your intuition. And it is the intuition which is really the soul, the feminine. The instinct, the feminine instinct, that creates a connection to the deeper dimension of our psyche, the collective dimension, the mythological dimension, and it is through that intuition that I started to feel the need to start writing, not only just reading and making these intuitive connections between one symbol and another, but I started to feel that I need to write. And my initial poetry was very, very abstract at best. You know, I would be sitting there just writing, one page, and then I would continue to the other page, and it was all in verse. But it didn't make a lot of sense. So I kept on going like this for a few weeks and so on, until I realized that it started to get shorter and shorter and shorter, that the sentences, the words were less garbled, and it started to eventually make sense. What was trying to come through me was getting clearer and clearer, but I stayed with it. That's the whole point. I stayed with writing this poetry, which initially looked like Jackson Pollock's painting. You know, you didn't know where it started or where it began. But it didn't matter. The whole point was to keep going. So eventually, I wrote such two-liners like this rose is worm bitten, but with time it will be enlivened. you know, I didn't know at that time that rose is a symbol of the it's an archetypal symbol of the feminine, you know, the way of the rose. And at that time it just simply spontaneously came through me. And you know, how to explain the symbol of the rose for you, for instance, if you hold the rose flower and you hold it and you look at it from the top, you will see that the petals are arranged in a spiral, and a spiral that's going through the center, you see? And it's this flower that is sitting at the apex of a stem, which is actually a labyrinth, a pathway between this physical world and the other, which supports us, the invisible, the mythological, the collective unconscious, the soul. So the rose is a symbol of the axis mundi, if you like, you know, your intuition, your third eye. Some people would like to point it to the heart. The heart is something, is your feeling, your compassion, your empathy for others. You will come to the level of the heart when we go to do service in our community. But it is here in your third eye, between the physical eyes, left and right eye, between, you know, this the third one, the one that sits in between the visible and the invisible. That is your pathway to the linking, to the understanding that the other dimension, the archetypal dimension in your poetry is not something that is separate, but it's always here. You know, like I said so many times in my comments or posts lately, there's no such thing as opposites. There's only the perception. There's a change of perception from unconscious to conscious participation with this invisible reality, this invisible quantum dimension that supports and enlivens you and everything else, this energy consciousness. So that's what happened to me at that time, back in those days, is that I simply had this feeling, this intuitive longing for writing. And although I've written my whole life, really, I loved writing, but it was never when I was younger, much younger. This was in my early 30s when this happened. But when I was younger, the writing was a little bit more mechanical. I still, for instance, I had while I lived, for instance, in Sydney, there was a few years before, I used to have this tradition, or used to have this habit of carrying a notepad and pen with me. And I used to say whatever occurred to me at that, in any moment where I was, whether I was at work or a train on the way to work or walking in the morning, I would write that down. But I never made anything more of it. There, while I was sitting in my sacred space on that swing, while looking at contemplating the symbols, the archetypal symbols, the language of the soul, in that book of the symbols, I started to make connections. But before I started to make the intuitive connections, these archetypal poetry started to come through me. And I would just to give you an example how I actually process these things, because sometimes reading someone else's work, you're going to get a whole lot of definitions and examples, but they're not going to click for you. It's actually in doing the work, you actually going out there and following meaning to a symbol that will actually click for you, and you will understand what it means, because it will be your intuition that is going to be giving you the answer. And the way I used to do it, and I still do it to this day, is I would go to Wikipedia. I would type in, for instance, fountain, because a fountain has come through into in my writing or in my dream, in my poetry. And there I wouldn't be so much interested, how many bricks it takes to build a fountain and what's the best geological position for a fountain. But I would straight away go to cultural significance or religious significance of a fountain. And there my intuition would straight away be interested. So what does it mean? Where does these fountains are usually positioned? And I would find that they're usually positioned right in the center of a square. And it is from the fountain that the water bubbles up. And another thing that interesting that I would notice is that these fountains are found all over the world, not just in my poetry or in my dreams, but all over the world. In other words, the image, the archetype is collective. It is common to all of humanity, not just to me. And that is a really significant point to be pointed out here when talking about mystic poetry. Another thing I wanted to mention is that when the way you come up to actually writing the mystic poetry, how it happens is you've got to get out of your own way. And to get out of your own way means you clear your head. I had a friend who was quite a talented psychic, and he used to read from tarot cards, more specifically from cartouche, apparently ancient Egyptian cards. And he said to me, Marek, if you ever want to, when you're writing, just clear your head of everything that you're thinking about. Nothing is important. Nothing is, you're not thinking about who said what or what you have to do, anything. For that period of time when you're working, when you're writing, the only thing that's important is what you're writing in that moment, what is trying to get through, the images in your head, and try to put them down into words. Another way of dealing with that is that when you are for instance, something happens to you in the world where you don't find any meaning in society anymore. You had enough. Maybe you were hurt. Someone hurt you, broke your heart. And suddenly you find yourself, like in the words of Peter Kingsley, to the effect that he said, when you go, there will become a time in your life when going to the left is hell. You going to the right is hell. If you go ahead, you're going to hell. And if you try to go back, you go back to utter hell. In other words, the only direction for you to get out of whatever it is that the hurt that you had, is to go inward. As they often say, the only way out is in. And then something happens. Then you strike up the friendship from the deeper dimension of the soul, of your psyche, the being of beings. And the important thing to stress here, that it's always there. It's not just the moment when you've decided that the only way out is in, but it's always there trying to grab your attention and tell you its story. It wants to tell you its story, for instance, through mystic poetry, to realize that it is alive, it is true, and it lives inside of you, through you, as you. You see? And the healing part, the wholeness, people talk about wholeness is this and wholeness is that, the union of the opposites. But the wholeness is really realizing that you and that deeper part of the psyche are not separate but identical mystery. Just in two aspects, the physical and the non-physical, which is really not even two aspects, it's really just one. Your face and the face of the mystery of God is the single face, the same face. And it is the same for every single human being. I go into that in a dream in my book, where we dream the single dream, where I describe the initiation to my the Grail, the discovery of the Grail dream, and the fractals. When the dream is actually shown to me inside the Grail, and it's a hologram and it's a fractal system. So if you haven't read about it, then it's right there in the book, and I go into it in the great detail. I also go into quite a great detail about how I've come to write the mystic poetry as well. And the way I started off, and another thing worth mentioning, the way I started to write mystic poetry is I would rhyme everything. So one gold with old, and rose with rose doze. So it flowed. The whole thing then flowed. It had it had a sort of a easy way of going. You know, you're not trying very hard. It just comes to itself, and that's in those moments when it flows, when it rhymes. Really, I even had a little dictionary, a rhyming dictionary, I remember, that I downloaded from the internet back in the day, and I used that for my work, for my writing, and and in one of the dreams, also in the book, when I'll go into a cave and I'm led by my feminine guide, the soul, the lady, and right in front of that huge tree, the flowering tree, there's a stream, and she initiates me to this mystery. And when she initiates me, she says things, this is where many men of old found their gold. So you see, she's talking poetry. The soul talks poetry. And that's our lost Western shamanic tradition. That everything nowadays has got to be reason and intellect and deductive science and religion, and which reject all this flowing. They reject it because once you have your own connection to this divine, either through dreams or through art or through mystic poetry, you no longer need anyone to be a mediator between you and God. You have a direct connection through that. So that's what mystic poetry is like. And that's what it is. But to get to that level, it's not that hard. You simply just got to drop the world, as it were. Or, like I said, if perhaps you're hurt or something happened to you, you've got a broken heart, and then you turn inward. To that end, there's a wonderful story that I'd like to share with you of Hafez. Perhaps some of you have heard of Hafez's poetry. He's a Middle Eastern poet, and he was a Middle Eastern poet, quite about the contemporary of Rumi, I would say, Persian poet. And the story goes like this, that Hafez he was born in the poor side of town, and he worked as a delivery boy in a local bakery. And one day, delivering bread to an affluent part of town, he saw a beautiful woman standing on a balcony, and he fell in love with her instantly. Now, he knew that because he's from a different class, a poorer class, and she from the rich, that his love will not be replied to her. She wouldn't love him back. So he vowed that he's going to he's going to incubate, he's going to contemplate, turn inward for as long as it takes for her to love him. And it was in that state when he was so disappointed with the world, with his unrequired love, with not being able to get what he wants, when he turned inward, and that's when an angel came to him and started to dictate his poetry to him. And so instead of so in that moment, his love for the lady was transformed into love of God, love for that angel who continued to communicate the poetry through Hafez for the rest of his life. So this was turning from the material world to mysticism, from poetry that we are told, or the poetry of the value of our TV values, if you like, to mystic poetry, the value of the complete human, complete life, in tune with nature, this mystery of nature that talks through us. There's a reason, to that end, there's a reason why so many poets, contemporary poets and poets of old, said that wound is the place through which light enters you. You see? When you are so turned inward that the outside world falls away, the inward world, the world of the mystery, the world of the eternal, of the archetypal, the world of the angel that speaks to your inner guide, if you like it, that will speak to you and become your partner, your trustworthy partner in life, your place of refuge that you can always turn to, always for help, always for advice. This then comes through, and you can have and nurture that for the rest of your life. So this is what I wanted to share with you this time around, and I'll talk to you next time. Thank you.